So in some way, it's a way to think about Africa as almost perfectly positioned to be a CDR solution provider. It's essentially what you need naturally for that to happen. Africa is sitting on a lot of these things, and so we owe the world as much as we owe ourselves to provide these resources to the world, while at the same time hopefully benefiting from them. At the moment, when you look at CDR and where it's currently being played out, it's very much a global north conversation. And that's everything from where's the most research happening, where the technology is being developed, who is buying CDR credits, where are grants going as far as CDR is concerned. And in many ways, it still remains a global north conversation. And there is a question, should Africa really care? Should Africa be involved in CDR? And this is part of what we're going to be looking at in today's episode. And so let's start back from Africa didn't cause this problem. Why should we be involved in removing CO2? And yes, it is true. We did not cause the climate problem. To this day, we still remain just responsible for about 3% of global emissions, so barely nothing. And in some countries, we could actually be getting to net negative in some cases. And so one would ask, should Africa stay out of the debate? The first thing I would say is, at this point, we don't have the luxury of saying who can and who should not be involved in climate action. Climate change is affecting all of us, and probably in Africa even more so. For those of us who live in Africa, we've seen different things happening that we've not seen before, whether it's big, floods at a magnitude that we didn't think was there before, droughts happening a lot more frequently, and just thinking about how prepared we are for the effects of climate change. We are not as prepared as we should be. And those of us in Africa know that we are bearing the brunt of climate change a lot more than other areas or other continents, and for different reasons, whether it's geography, but also just our resiliency and just how our infrastructure is set up. And so, if for no other reason than to be able to secure the survival of our, the future survival of our continent, we need to be at the forefront of climate action. We can lay the blame game later. We can figure out who's responsible, but at the same, we cannot afford to do that while allowing climate change to continue in the way that it is continuing. So I think there's that first bit that we need to, be all clear about, which is it is an imperative for us. There is no, we wish we don't have a choice in this. We actually have to fight climate change, and we have to take climate action. Doesn't matter whose fault it is. I think we're all bearing the brunt. We can apportion blame later, as it were. Now that we understand that there's an imperative for us to be involved in climate action, and in particular CDR, because that's our current topic, one would ask, why Africa? Interestingly enough, in as much as we didn't cause a problem, we happen to be naturally endowed with the resources that will be needed for climate action, and in particular CDR. What are some of these things that I'm talking about? So one, Africa is sitting on more than 40% of the world's renewable energy, and we will need a lot of energy for some of these technologies. For example, things like direct air capture require a lot of energy, but it has to be renewable energy, because remember, you cannot use fossil fuel energy to remove carbon, because that's using carbon to remove carbon doesn't make sense. So it makes sense for us to do CDR in places that have the most renewable energy, and Africa just happens to be sitting on a lot of potential as far as renewable energy is concerned. The second thing is land. Africa is a fairly large continent, and we have 60% of the world's arable land, and we will require land for some of these technologies. So for example, things like afforestation, reforestation, soil sequestration. So there are a lot of things that do require land, and Africa happens to have that land. The third thing is talent. Again, remember, this is going to be a whole industry that's being created. It will require labor to do it. And who happens to have the fastest growing population? Africa. And we need jobs for our young people, but at the same time, there will be, the world will need labor for these growing industries for CDR to happen. And so we just happen to have that talent that is needed for that. And this is a win-win situation as far as I'm concerned, which is how do we provide jobs for our young people while at the same time doing CDR on our continent. And then the other thing which I think is important to note, and usually people don't think about that, is we happen to sit on some very unique geologies that actually allow us to store carbon underground. And so when you think about technologies such as direct air capture and storage that require mineralization, usually the way this technology works is You remove carbon from the air, and then you have to store it in special rocks, and it's going to be stored there permanently. Africa, and particularly the East African Rift Valley, happens to have some of these unique geologies that are needed. And so there's no reason why we cannot position ourselves as a hub for CDR, and particularly for some of these specialized technologies that require specialized geology. So in some way, it's a way to think about Africa as almost perfectly positioned to be a CDR solution provider. It's essentially what you need naturally for that to happen. Africa is sitting on a lot of these things, and so we owe the world as much as we owe ourselves to provide these resources to the world, while at the same time hopefully benefiting from them. Okay, now that we know that Africa is well endowed to be a CDR provider, solution provider, what are the opportunities for Africa? Again, should we care? And this is where it gets interesting if you care about investments and you care about business. So different experts or different studies have estimated that CDR is going to be $1 trillion industry. Trillion with a T, not B. So it's important to remember that. So if all goes as planned, $1 trillion+ will be spent in this industry. And if I was Africa and I was sitting on the very thing that the world needs to drive a CDR, $1 trillion industry, maybe I should be sitting at the table and saying, I should be part of these investments, or here's, let me create the right opportunity or the right environment for these investments to flow into Africa. And I think it's important for us to think about CDR from a business perspective and not from a donor perspective or a grant perspective. And yes, we need grants, we need all the philanthropic funding going into this. But the more we can present Africa as an investment destination as far as CDR is concerned, and people need to make decisions for what are the best CDR locations, and hopefully they land on Africa because we have cheap energy, we have the labor, we have the land, and we have everything else that people need for CDR. The easier it's going to be for these investments to flow to Africa. And hopefully it's not just investments flowing into Africa and technologies flowing into Africa. Hopefully we'll also begin to see our own populations coming up with their own versions of CDR technologies, or enhancing what's already being done, or doing more research in terms of what's being done. And so I think if Africa begins to think about this $1 trillion industry that's starting to emerge, that's starting to grow, hopefully we can position ourselves in a way that makes us ready for this. And I think one other point that's important for us to consider is, unlike other industries, CDR is as novel or as new as it comes. So no one region right now has a dominance on it. So it's almost like a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for us to be at the forefront of an industry that is just starting out. And if we position ourselves right, we could actually become the dominant leader in this industry, which therefore means in 10, 15, 20 years, when the die has been cast in some ways and people know where they're going, Africa should be sitting pretty in the sense that we own or we are controlling a significant part of this industry. So I think it's important for us to remember that this is a new industry, and we have just as good an opportunity as any other continent, and in our case, maybe even a better opportunity, just given some of the things that we have going in our favor. So again, remember, $1 trillion industry, very new industry, we can get into it very early on, and we have everything that the world needs for it. So now that we know it's a $1 trillion industry and Africa should get into it, one could ask, okay, but shouldn't you be doing CDR in the places where you're emitting carbon? And that's always an interesting question, because there's always this thought that if you're producing CDR, carbon dioxide in one area, that's exactly where you should be doing CDR. So this actually goes back to why climate is a problem that's affecting all of us, regardless of where carbon is emitted. So carbon happens to be one of those gases, it happens to be one of those gases that's evenly distributed globally, in a sense. Of course, there are different variations. We start getting into altitudes, etc. But it really doesn't matter where carbon is produced. It tends to spread evenly across the globe. And in the same manner, it doesn't matter where you remove the carbon dioxide. So it doesn't matter that a lot of the emissions, say, are happening in the US and China, because at the moment those are the largest contributors to greenhouse gases. We can actually do CDR in Africa to counter what's happening in some of these other countries that are emitting. And so that's an important point for us to remember, where yes, the emissions are happening in one part of the globe, but you can actually be doing the removals in another part of the globe and still maintaining a net zero and still getting us to net zero, which is what we're trying to get to. And this is a key pointer that Africa should actually be, trumpeting out there and saying, yes, you caused the problem, we can solve the problem, and we don't have to emit for us to reduce the carbon or remove the carbon. We can actually remove the carbon that's already in the atmosphere regardless of where it was emitted. So I think that's an important point for us to keep in mind. This is a $1 trillion industry. We can do removals anywhere. So does that mean that people will come tomorrow and start removing carbon from from Africa? Maybe not. And I think here again we have to be very deliberate as a continent to say, here's an emerging industry. What should we do to make sure that we are ready for it? We take advantage of it, and we actually get people coming to invest in Africa as far as CDR is concerned. And there are a couple of things that are important for us to think about. One, it goes without saying, we need to create the right policy and enabling environment. And again, we could spend, and we'll probably in future episodes actually spend some time breaking down what does that mean? What are these policies we're talking about? But at the bare minimum, people need to have clarity around what's a regulation, how do I set up, how easy is it to set up, what is required. So the clarity around what the regulation is, I think, is going to be important. And so it's important that especially government officials and other policymakers get ahead of the game in the sense and figure out what are the technologies, what regulations are needed, and actually begin to craft regulations, but in a way that is protecting Africa, yes, but at the same time, encouraging investment. So the lack of clarity in regulation is going to be something that will hinder us, as it's unfortunately often hindered us in previous years in other industries. The second bit is the talent. So in as much as we have a young population and it's growing, if people don't have the right skills, then you really cannot bring industry here. And so again, begin to think about what it would take, say, if we're going to grow an industry, you will need a certain specialized skill set. So we need to be quite deliberate about what skills are needed at what level, and can we make sure that our talent is prepared for this. And again, think about the fact that CDR is diverse. There are different types of CDR methodologies. Some will require a certain level of skill set. Some will require very, very specialized skill sets. And we need it all. Some of it could just mean getting students in our colleges or universities, understanding what CDR is and beginning to orient their career and mindsets towards CDR. Some of it might require very, very specialized training. And the question is, how do we make sure that we're being very, very deliberate about providing the skills? So for example, right now in Kenya, there's a national dialogue about skills for the green economy. Is CDR a part of that conversation? Are we being deliberate to make sure that as we are working with our TVETs and our universities and our schools to figure out the curricula, are we including CDR in that conversation? Because again, remember, CDR is a little bit different and a little bit more specialized than just your regular climate conversation. And part of the reason we're doing this podcast is to make sure that there's this distinction between other climate activities and CDR in particular. And because CDR is emerging as this really distinct, potentially large industry, has very specific methodologies and technologies, we also should become very specialized in how we think about it and the kinds of skill sets that we bring to the table and we bring to bear. The other piece is around developing our renewable energy. This is a really critical piece because in as much as Africa sits on, say, 40% of the world's renewable energy, we're barely tapping. I mean, in some countries, you're probably talking about 1% of solar potential, for example, having been exploited. And in some countries, not at all. In Kenya, for example, we are sitting on our grid is about 93% green. But then when you think about how much potential there is, we have gigawatts of potential that could be developed. And there are different reasons why the energy is not being developed, whether it's a question of the right policies or investments or getting people to come in and provide demand for it. But we'll need to find a way to crack the renewable energy piece. Because again, a big part of CDR will go to places where the technologies can find cheap renewable energy. And so we can get ahead of the curve by providing renewable energy. And the good thing with that is not only are you attracting a whole new industry, you're actually increasing the amount of energy available to the citizenry, which is actually just good for the economy as a whole, because again, remember, we really can't develop an economy or economies without energy. Energy is fundamental to the development of an economy. So again, it's one of those things that would actually be a really good give and take, where you're offering renewable energy so that industry can come, and especially CDR, while at the same time providing opportunities for your citizenry. So in addition to everything else that Africa needs to do to prepare itself, we need to really critically think about compliance markets and how we ready ourselves to get into compliance markets. Again, the issue of compliance markets, Article 6, is something that will require its own episode, if not episodes, for us to really delve deeper and understand what it means. But I think for now, it's just important for us to say Article 6 is in conversations, hopefully by the next COP, or in the coming months or in the coming years, it will be it will be ratified, and countries will actually be able to enforce it, and we'll actually begin to see countries trading carbon credits amongst one another. And I think it's important that Africa again gets ahead of the game here, because remember, we're probably going to be more of a net provider or net supplier of carbon credits rather than buying them, because we don't necessarily need to reduce our own emissions in that case. And so to the extent that our regulation is right, to the extent that we are ready from a compliance perspective and we can get into the compliance markets once this open up, say in Europe, in the US, or in Asia, the better for us. And so I know some countries such as Ghana and Kenya have done some work towards getting some readiness towards Article 6, but then still quite a lot more needs to be done. But I think in general would encourage the continent to really get ahead of the compliance conversation. What do we need to put in place? What regulations do we need to put in place? So that by the time that opens up and Article 6 is ratified, we're ready to go as a continent, and can actually take advantage of, again, what could be a really game-changing industry for us. I hope this episode has convinced you why Africa should be playing a leading role in CDR, and what are some things that we need to do to make sure that we are playing that leading role in CDR. Thank you for listening, and I hope you'll join me for the next episode. My name is Bilha Ndirangu, and this is CDR Plus.